So at first I'm simply going to draw out one of the images. This one is wrapped almost as a candy. I'm mark where you guys can see me. And I'm just going to sketch in. I'm using this cyan blue pencil that is often used by the illustrators. That is great if you want to scan your work and you don't want to see the you don't want the pencil lines to be visible. This is a great pencil to use. Apparently the scanner or the photographic equipment does not recognize this blue, and so it becomes invisible once you scan it in. And I'm going to actually draw out some of the folds. Not sure how well you can see it. To help guide me once I start putting in the resist. So in this painting I am going to use fine line masking fluid. This is the one I have. Daniel Smith also makes a great masking fluid, but I ran out of mine, and this was the fastest one that I could get on Amazon delivered to me, so I'm going to use this one today. So you could see I'm not necessarily drawing out each fold completely. I'm sort of marking those pivotal moments where it's folded or turns, where there's a jagged angle. And I certainly am not making an exact map of them. I am trying to capture the overall kind of movement or rhythm of these folds. So as they kind of bunch up in one area, it becomes more intense, there's more of them, and as they open up there's fewer. So it sort of captures that energy of the plastic being tied or wrapped, or also the edge of the plastic, what that looks like, how it's pulled around the fruit also, like it's pulled around this way here, and there's a little extra piece. So all of this I'm trying to capture in my drawing, and I imagine that my drawing is not going to be perfectly accurate because I'm doing it for you guys for the video and not taking as long as I typically would in checking all the details and proportions and so forth of my drawing. So I'm just capturing kind of the essence of the saran wrap and the essence of the form that is made by the saran wrap, as well as by the bell pepper as well. You can see I started with my forms being a little bit more rounded and soft, and then I realized that this particular plastic creates really I'm going to bring this a little bit tighter, very angular and kind of jaggedy forms. It's a different way that we look at an object when we're drawing it than when we are just looking at it casually. My younger students recently mentioned that everything that we draw, I tell them that there's other forms within the form. So for example, we can notice like there's an S shape that's repeated, or there's a circle that's repeated in some kind of form. Well, in this saran wrapped bell pepper is full of angles, angular kind of jaggedy shapes, really sharp and pointed. You know, the turns and twists are very sharp and angular. So that's something that I noticed only once I started drawing it, not when I first looked at it. So drawing is really important not so much in that it gives you guidelines to follow when you're using color, but drawing is really important in that you begin, this is the first step, that you begin to get to know this thing a little bit more intimately and a little more critically as an artist. Artist looks at things with curiosity, but also the kind of study, a kind of scrupulous study that's almost a little bit scientific, where the artist is trying to figure out some kinds of patterns, some kinds of visual rhythms that are going on in this form. So I hope that helps you a little bit. When you begin to draw, it is not so much that you're drawing to give yourself a perfect outline to follow. It is that you really have to look at your objects closely. Look for something in them, something that is particular, something that is characteristic of this object that you're drawing. Discover something in it that you haven't seen in it before, even though you may have looked at and held a bell pepper many times previously. And as I draw, it's almost like I thought I already drew this part, but now I see it differently. And as I move my way around the drawing, I rediscover more and more nuances about this form that hopefully will make for a closer representation of it in my painting. Again, it's not so much that I'm looking to represent that, make sure that it looks just like the photograph. I'm not as concerned with replicating the photograph. What I am more interested in is capturing the spirit of this saran wrap. What's the flavor? What's the spice in it? And the spirit is revealed in the details of the form and how things are fitted together, how the form is transformed by light, how the form fits its way onto the space of the paper. All of these nuances, all of these subtleties that you discover in the process of drawing give us a sense of life, create a kind of lifelike image. All right, so now that my drawing is done, what I'm going to do on this one is, again, I'm using this fine line masking fluid with an applicator. This is a kind of needle applicator, very fine point, and I'm going to apply the masking fluid in all the places where I want to preserve the light. It's a little bit tricky applying this masking fluid, but it's also a lot of fun. So rather than trying to create some kind of one uniform line, you can sort of make these very fluid strokes. Your masking fluid does not need to be thick or uniform. It can be very, you can kind of drag the applicator through, make your lines very thin. Try to avoid these big bulges of masking fluid that occur when you stay in one place for too long. It's a little bit tricky creating points, so if you really want a pointed edge, you kind of have to lift up the masking fluid a little bit so it doesn't have a rounded edge but more of a sharp pointed edge like that. It's also going to take less time to dry if you put it on in thinner strokes. Typically, you do want to let several hours for the masking fluid to dry, or even overnight if you're putting it in bigger areas and thicker strokes. Again, with the lines of this, I'm not necessarily, just like you can see, I'm not necessarily like slowly following the lines of my drawing, but I'm drawing again with the masking fluid. This time, I'm only drawing the lights, the little highlights, anything that I want to be purely white, or even not purely white, even just the lighter areas, you can mask them out and later create glazes over the white paper, but you would have those sharp kind of, so any kind of sharp light areas that you want to stay very clear, you can mask them out with this masking fluid. Now I am not demonstrating some kind of, I'm not demonstrating like a super realist painting. Otherwise, if you want a super realist effect, you would really need to be much more precise with your drawing. My drawing is not anywhere nearly precise for a super realist image, but it will capture the essence and the feel of reflections in saran wrap. Try also to avoid kind of generic marks that you repeat, like if the line is long, really move your hand through very quickly. Avoid the kind of squiggles, repetitive squiggles that sometimes I see students have a tendency to make. So really allow move. If you do create like a little bulb like I just have been, you know, take your needle and push through it to extend it further a little bit. Here I have whole areas, so I have to sort of shade this in, entire areas of highlights. And it would be wise if you are a right-handed person, like if you draw with your right hand, to move from left to right rather than the other way around, so that you do not end up putting your palm into the areas that you have already created. So you want to move the opposite way of the one that I've been moving, but that's okay. And to avoid those little marks, again, just keep your hand moving as you're squeezing out the bottle. Try to avoid staying in one place for too long. And here I want really skinny lines in that knotted area where the plastic comes together. And you can see the lines that I made earlier are already starting to dry. You want to have both thin lines as well as some shapes that are highlighted. At least that's what I noticed in this image. And when you want to have bigger shapes, you can squeeze a bit more on the bottle for more fluid to come out and create and fill, so that's an easier way to fill shapes, and you can kind of pull it through. kind of know that I needed to highlight these areas. They're just a little bit lighter. And I don't really want that much texture in here. This is a smoother area. Probably would have been better off just painting it lighter. But we'll see how it comes out. We'll have both in this area. I left some of it open and some of it masked. You know, don't overdo this either. Sometimes I could see how there could be a tendency to do too much. But you do, if you want to get detailed, you really want to get all the tiny little marks. All right, and once you have completed all your marks, something like that, then you're going to let your drawing dry completely, your masking fluid to dry. When you're finished with your masking fluid, make sure that you replace the needle back into the applicator. This will keep it nice and moist. It's very easy for the masking fluid to dry out. And in the meantime, while my masking fluid is drying in the first drawing, I'm going to make a second drawing that I'm going to paint without applying the masking fluid, and instead using adding a little bit of gum arabic. This is a mixture of gum arabic and water that I made. I'm going to add just a little bit of that into my palette to my paints. Again, I'm starting with a little bit of a gesture drawing, just sort of sketching the energy and dynamic of the fruit. I'm used to drawing with mechanical pencils, and I keep forgetting that you have to push them down to get more lead out. And that will do it. I'm not doing as much detail right now. And I'm going to go straight to painting. So now that the resist has dried, I can also wet this paper, or wet it in parts. Maybe I'll start with the pepper. And it's only been maybe like an hour and a half, so hopefully it has dried well enough. And just a reminder, as I feed the color, I'm going to start with some warmer tones first. As I feed the color into the wet paper, I want to make sure that the color is a bit denser than a typical watercolor wash. It's a bit a unique kind of feeling of painting over the bumps of the resist. And I feed lots of pigment in to make sure the color is nice and saturated, because as it's drying it's going to lighten up. Oh, I was painting the wrong pepper. Just around this way. You can see that you can be a lot freer when painting. With resist. We still need some of those darks to allow the highlights to stand out. I'm gonna darken some of these areas. Give a wash to the background a bit, very light wash, just to give a little bit of ambience. This is, I could say, a study. I'm going to keep it white, just giving it a little bit of a tone, a change in temperature. Just a little bit of softness to soften that white. But it's basically going to look pretty much white, just with a touch of maybe like a tinted white. All right, I'm gonna let it dry and then lift up the resist. So now that the painting is dry, I'm going to remove the masking fluid. You can use a regular eraser, rubber cement eraser, or you can even sometimes do it with your fingers like this. And what I noticed is that some of my lines are a bit squiggly. So we're gonna have to go in and make them look a little bit more like reflections. puppy at work again, helping me out, tearing apart the carpet. See, the masking fluid is kind of rubbery and it just sort of peels off. I think there's some interesting marks in here. Just think these first ones were a little bit, I'm not fond of these marks that have a little blob on one end and clearly have been put on with resist. But I do like these thinner long marks. I also like some of the play of marks in here. You can go over it with your hand just to gently to feel any areas that have not been lifted. All right, so removed all the masking fluid and we're going to use a little bit of water and a little painting to soften some of these edges so they're not all the same. Although it's an interesting effect, it's not exactly it doesn't exactly reflect what's happening in the image, what's happening in the reflections. So you can go back with water and soften some of the edges, kind of like that. So immediately you can see there's more roundness to this edge. You can also tint some of them so that they're not as white. Make them a little bit more subtle, not as obvious. But then you can leave them just as in the places that are a bit more crisp and in the light. And also what I notice is some of these highlights have a tint of blue to them, so I'm going to layer a little bit of cobalt So again, just like in the first painting, this process a bit more tedious and slow. So you need to be patient and methodical about it, kind of looking at one area at a time. What I'm trying to do here is kind of bring a little bit of wholeness to this shape here that is formed by the tied plastic. And when you remove the colors, at first you just lift the color, and if you keep moving your brush around too much, you're basically spreading that color around. So you need to wash the color of your brush and come back with a clean brush to lift it. Again, I want to leave some hard edge reflections and then soften a couple to give us the roundness, to find some of the forms. Like right here, like this is really bright, but then on this edge it can be softened. As it turns around the pepper. And we can add a little bit of cobalt in there. Also, form in here. And I'm not going to define precisely each one of these forms and folds. I also like kind of the freedom of suggestion in some of these, and the way the lines just kind of move through. It's beautiful. So I'm going to leave that. Plastic being pulled through. Maybe turn a bit more here. Soften that a bit. Again, the goal is to make an interesting painting, at least my goal, not necessarily to make a super realistic rendering of all the folds. So I'm making my decisions as I go, keeping that focus in mind. So how can I make the painting interesting? What aspect of reflections or folds that I want to bring out? To keep the painting exciting, to have these changes going on. Could lighten this up a little bit. But I don't want to lighten up too many areas. When you do lift watercolor paint, it makes the color somewhat washed out, gives it like a washed out look. And while it looks nice in some areas, like here, it kind of has that paleness to it. If you have it in too many areas, it looks kind of strange. And you can feed the pigment back into it, like if you wanted to brighten up the area that you lifted, like if you wanted to change the color slightly, you Maybe I want to give it a little bit of a warmer color here. So maybe just a few more in here, potentially using a little bit of a darker tone to just emphasize some, but I kind of like how this plastic came out, so it might be just a few places that I want to emphasize. So remember, there's a big difference between the painting brush and the lifting brush. I'm not very fond of painting with the lifting brush. It's stiff and makes for very different kinds of marks. So I'm going to stop just about here as a study. It's not a finished painting. I would probably work a bit more on the shadow, but it kind of gives you an idea on the process of and the steps that are involved in creating reflections using resist. And you can also, actually, maybe I will overpaint this shadow. I'll just leave it.